Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I just appreciate you watching. This week, we're starting to have a little more fun, maybe, I think, with CSS. You know, one of the things that, as I talk to other people who are taking these classes, one of the things that we talk about when we talk about CSS specifically is how immediate the feedback is as to whether we've done something right or we've done something wrong in terms of how we've written our code. With Python and other programming languages, right, we might write several lines of code and we might have made one error, and it might take us several minutes to notice whether or not what we did worked. And it's not very friendly with us. And with HTML, it might be a little bit overly friendly with us. As many of you discovered while you were, doing your assignments for the last couple of modules. Right? You can put HTML in the completely wrong place and it'll still work, right? Even though it won't be standards compliant. And so we want to make sure we're writing standards compliant code. We want to make sure that we're doing things right. Even though it's not causing us any issues now, it might cause us some issues in the near future. Especially now that we are addressing things with CSS and with JavaScript. And this module, we are addressing things with CSS, and as we're starting to move things around with CSS here, addressing the box model in this module, things do, this module is a little more challenging, in my opinion, when it comes to dealing with CSS, right? The concepts in this module are a bit less friendly, a little more difficult to get our heads wrapped around. But that's why I do them first when we're talking about CSS. Because they are a little bit tougher for us to kind of understand as we're going through. So I like to, that's one of the kind of the rules that I make for myself, is I take on more challenging things first, and then leave the lesser tasks for later on, right? So, next week we'll talk about color and font and making things pretty and all that kind of stuff, and that's real easy, right? So we'll get started with some of the tougher things with CSS. Trying to think if there are any announcements that I need to make before we get into it. I guess I should say that yesterday was the first day for registration for returning students. So for all of you, for registering for the spring, registration is open. So you want to make sure that you are, going ahead and getting on the ball and registering for spring, making sure you're getting the courses that you need. Don't wait until the last minute, because the course that you need in the spring might not be there. You want to make sure that you're getting that now. So just a reminder about that really quickly as we're getting started here. And I'm going to try to cover as much as possible over the course of our hour here. As usual, I'm not going to get it quite all covered. I'm going to do my best to cover as much as possible, though, and do some demonstrations and work with some different stuff here as we kind of progress through and get started talking about CSS. But everything that you need, as always, is covered, in either in the live class, in the module, somewhere, right? I don't leave you without the tools that you need somewhere. Right? So you've got access to everything that you need, and you can always ask if you have any questions. But when we're dealing with CSS, we're really dealing with rules. Right? When we think about CSS, we can think about them as rules. And so CSS is another acronym, just like HTML was an acronym. If we remember back to when we were first talking about HTML a couple weeks ago, we said that HTML was an acronym that stood for Hypertext Markup Language. And now CSS is an acronym that stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that cascade means in the future. But when we think about what a cascading style sheet is, it's essentially just a set of rules, right? And these are rules that kind of dictate how the content on our website will be displayed to us. So if we think about our website, we think about our HTML as sort of the framework that we were working with, right? We kind of talked about the HTML that we were developing over the past couple of weeks as this blueprint for a house. Right, and we still use our house analogy on into this week, although we do change it up slightly. We do change it up a little bit in terms of how we talk about our house this week. We are still using a similar analogy. As we are talking about CSS, we're talking about the rules for the way the things in our house basically looks. Right, and you can almost think about it, from a perspective of, your own home. Right, you might have some rules in your own home about what goes in certain rooms. You might have certain decor that's not allowed in the living room. Maybe that's only allowed in another room in the house. Maybe you have a game room, for example. And that decor is only allowed in the game room. It's only allowed over there. And so we have this rule set up, this rule that's in place for what's allowed here versus what's allowed there. Or maybe you have another rule that dictates, like what you're allowed to do with the things that are in your house. Like, no feet on the furniture or no shoes should be worn in the house. These are different rules that people have, that kind of dictate the way that things are managed and handled in their home. And we can kind of think about CSS in the exact same way, right? Like, these are the rules that dictate the way things look and the way things interact with one another and the way things are kind of handled in our HTML. And so each of these rules consist of two parts. One part is a selector, and one part is a declaration. And when we look at an example of a CSS rule, we'll talk more about this type of CSS rule next week, right? Because this is a color-based CSS rule. So this is a CSS rule for font color, right? So this week we're going to be more focused on box model. So we're not going to talk as much about what's going on here, more than as much as we're going to talk about just the structure of this rule. Right, but one thing that you probably noticed right off the bat is that something here looks familiar to you. Right, we see this H2 here. This is something that we call our selector. Right, and there are different types of selectors. This in particular is one that we call an element selector because it selects an HTML element. In this case, it selects an H2 heading element. Right, so, as we kind of worked through our HTML elements, we built H2 HTML elements. And so in our CSS, we can reference the H2s in our HTML using an H2 element selector. And what that's going to tell my browser is that's going to tell my browser to look through the DOM, right? If you'll remember back a couple weeks ago, we talked about the idea of the DOM, of the document object model. look through the DOM and find every instance of this element occurring. Find every instance of this H2 element occurring. Find every heading level 2 occurring in my site. And then apply this set of rules. To it. Right, so that's our selector. And you can see where the selector is located in relation to these curly braces. Right, these curly braces create what we call a declaration block, which we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But that defines the beginning and the end of the declarations for a particular selector. So everything that is in between this opening curly brace and this closing curly brace in our CSS is a declaration. In this case, our declaration is color red for the selector that is present there on the outside of the opening curly brace. In this case, it is an H2. Now, in addition, we can also take that declaration and break it down even further, right? Because we can see that this declaration has two parts to it. Right? It has a name, right? Color, a colon there in the middle that separates that name and what's on the other side of that colon, which is, in this case, red. So in this instance, what we would call color is the property, right? So the property of this declaration is color. So this declaration has the property of color, and on the other side of the colon there is the value. So we can break this down even further, right? And so we can say that, okay, we have a selector for each of our CSS rules. We have a selector, and for each of our selectors, we have a declaration block, which is defined by an area of curly braces, an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. And we can put as many declarations inside of that declaration block as we want to, right? As we need to apply to that particular selector element, right? Whatever we're selecting. And each of those declarations has a property and a value for that property. And every CSS rule is written the exact same way. Right? The only thing that varies is the property and the accompanying value of said property. So in this case, we see this written linearly, right? We see this declaration block written all on one line. However, if we wanted to, right, which is what I normally do, we could write this similarly by breaking it down to multiple lines. Like so. Right, just like in HTML, when we talked about HTML and the spacing didn't really matter when it came to HTML, right? We could put extra lines between our different elements and things of that nature. We can put extra lines and stuff like that between our declarations here in CSS as well. The only big thing that we need to realize is that all of these punctuations need to happen where they're happening, right? We need to create our declaration blocks with our curly braces. Our colons need to go here. Our semicolons need to go at the end of our declarations so that we know where one declaration stops and the next declaration starts. regardless of whether we write them linearly, like this, like it's showing in the example here, or if we write them stacked, which is the way that I normally write my CSS rules. I normally write them stacked this way just because I believe they are easier to read, and I think you all would find that they're easier to read also. So I encourage you all to take that approach with them. But basically every single CSS rule is written in this exact same way. Like once you kind of get this basic structure down, you can work with any single CSS rule. You're just varying the property and varying the value of said property. So what exactly does this all do? Right, so the selector points to the HTML element that you want to style. Right, and we'll talk about specificity and we'll talk about selecting a different element in just a moment. Right, the declaration block contains one or more declarations separated by semicolons. And each declaration includes a CSS property name and a value separated by a colon. CSS declarations always end with a semicolon, right? Remember that semicolon, super important when it comes to programming, right? It's basically like having a period at the end of our sentence. It tells our browser basically where one declaration stops and the next declaration begins. If we do not put that semicolon there, it won't know where one stops and the next one begins, and it will cause some issues. So that semicolon is super important. And we have those declaration blocks that are surrounded by curly braces. So these are all big deals to us. Now, we've talked about having this element selector, right? And I'm going to switch over to a replet here. And so let's talk about a replet really quickly here and just talk about some of the things that we can kind of make sure that we're doing here with our replet as we're working with it. One, remember that you can take out what this JavaScript here on line 20. That's what shows the little blue badge when your site is popped out into a new tab. I'll show it to you here. This blue badge that's down here that's made with replet here. You don't need to show that there, so we can take that out. You can also take out the comment above that tells you the information about the blue badge, because if you're not going to show the badge, then you don't need the comment there about that as well. You want to keep this script that's here on line 13, but you can take out hello world that's there above it. And you want to make sure that you keep this link to this style sheet here, because that's what tells my browser that this HTML file is linked to this CSS file that's in my document here. And so I'm actually going to be writing my CSS rules in this style.css. And so, for example, one of the interesting things that I always usually like to do when I start out doing this is I like to start out by showing people that there is an invisible box that is drawn around every single HTML element. So I'm going to take and I'm going to make an H1 here in my replet. I'm just going to type in a hello world here, just really simple, and run the page. So now I just have a really simple hello world here on my output. Maybe we'll add a paragraph in here as well. This is some paragraph text, just so we can see a little bit of paragraph text there as well. So now when we pop this out, we can kind of look at this site. And you can't see it here because it is invisible. But on every single website, there is an invisible box drawn around every single element that's on the page. And this works with what we call the box model. And we'll get more into the box model as we progress today. We're going to try to get as far into the box model as we can. But if we inspect our element here, if we use our inspect element tool, we can actually see here, if we expand out our inspect element tool, depending on how yours is kind of laid out, you might have to scroll down a little bit. You will see at somewhere in your inspect element tool, you'll have something that looks like this here. Let me circle it. This here. And this is our box. This is a box model visualizer. And I can actually hover over the different areas of this box model visualizer. These are the different areas of our box model that we'll be talking about today: margin, border, padding, and content. And this is that invisible box that I was talking about. When I hover over that center box, it actually shows it up on the screen there. That invisible box that I was talking about. There's an invisible box that shows up. And if I check out paragraph here, there's that invisible box there as well. Right, so there's an invisible box that's drawn around everything. And by default, this box is the full width of the window, right? Unless it is an image, some kind of inline element. And by default, it is as tall as the content that is inside of the box. So it grows to fit the content that's inside the box. So you'll see there that hello world is just as tall as it needs to be to fit, that H1 there is just as tall as it needs to be to fit hello world. My paragraph there is just as tall as it needs to be to fit that paragraph text. Right? And if I had more text there, it would be taller to fit the more, to fit the amount of text that's there. But you might be wondering, well, like if you had different H1s, right? Like one of the things that we were talking about there was like, well, we can use H1 as many times on a page as we want to, right? Because H1 is for a main topic. So if we could have, several new main topics on a page. So you might be wondering, well, how do we get more specific with the way that we select elements? Because, I can have multiple H1s on a page, right? Because I can have multiple main topics on a page. I can obviously have multiple paragraphs on a page because there's only one paragraph tag. So if I was using paragraphs, then I can only use one paragraph tag. So if I'm using my element selector, which is just the name of the tag, whether it's H1 or P or whatever, then that's going to cause some issues. Right, and that's true. So we actually have to kind of prepare our HTML to work with our CSS a little bit. And that's where we use attributes. Right, and I want you all to pay close attention to where this attribute is. Right, in this case we're using a class attribute. And the class attribute goes inside of the opening tag before the greater than symbol. And so I have a class attribute and I also have an ID attribute. And this allows me to increase specificity. Right? In CSS, we work with something called specificity. And different levels of specificity allow me to address specific things differently. So by default, we deal with the element selector, which is just the tag name. A for an anchor tag or a link. H1 for a heading level 1. P for a paragraph, so on and so forth. Do that in our CSS. But if we want to be more specific and we want to do something for a particular tag or a particular element, that we don't want to do for all of them, because we said that our CSS is going to look through our DOM and it's going to find every element that is an H1, and it's going to apply these rules to every element of that type. Then we want to prepare it for success by giving it an ID or a class attribute. And we can give them whatever name we want as a class or an ID, as long as we match it in our CSS. So an ID selector, in our HTML, we just put ID equals, and then in quotes, before the greater than symbol, we just put the name of the ID that we want there. And we can only use one particular ID for one particular element in a page. That makes the ID the most specific CSS selector that can exist. Right, so I'll go ahead and I'll do a little bit of preparation here. Let's say I want to take this second H1 here and I want to make it a specific ID selector. I'd go before that greater than symbol. I'd write ID equals, and then in quotes, I would give it some name. Maybe I'd call it main topic 2, right? And that's fine. I can call it whatever I want. As long as I refer to it by the same thing in my CSS. So I can go ahead and create a declaration block on my CSS page that can serve as a place for CSS to go, even though I'm not going to put any rules in there quite yet. And so for an ID, if it's an ID attribute, I start it with a hashtag or #, whichever, based on whatever generation you're with, is going to be, depending on what you call that symbol. Right? Believe it or not, programmers actually, we actually call them hashes more than we call them #, even older programmers. Because if if you remember back to when we were talking about Python and we talked about the shebang, right? It's called a shebang because it's hash bang, and it's the hash and a exclamation point, which is we also call a bang. Right? So we start off with our hash symbol here, and then the name that we wrote in our HTML, which we just wrote main topic 2. Main topic 2. So notice that we put quotes in our HTML, but we don't put quotes here in our CSS. And then we put our curly braces to make our declaration block. Now you'll see that we have a little bit of yellow squiggle there underneath main topic 2. And that's because we've declared this, but we haven't put any rules in there yet. Right? So once we put some rules in there, that'll go away. And that'll be fine. And so what's happening here is when our browser's reading this CSS file, it's seeing this hashtag, and it's saying, hash. I know hash. Hash means ID. So now I'm going to go through the DOM, and I'm going to look through the DOM and find any element that says ID equals. And then I'm going to look for this name as the ID after ID equals. So now I'm going to look for anything that says ID equals main topic 2. And whatever has the ID equals main topic 2 in it, I'm going to apply whatever rules we put in this declaration block to that element. That's what CSS and my browser are saying here. And remember that only one element can have this particular ID. I can give other elements other ID names. But only this element, now that I've given this element the ID name of main topic 2, only this element can be called main topic 2. If I try to call anything else main topic 2, it's going to break my code. But I do have a solution for, being maybe a little less specific. Right? Because we have the class. The class allows us to take maybe you don't want just one thing called out. Maybe you want a handful of things called out for some specific stylings. And that's what our class selector is for. So our class selector, similar to our ID selector, we're going to go in the opening tag for that element right before the greater than symbol, and we're going to write class equals and just give it a name, whatever we want to name it. And we can actually use that in multiple elements to apply the same styling to multiple elements. So it is more specific than just addressing the element name, but it's less specific than just addressing an ID, because an ID can only be applied to one thing. Right, so a class has to be applied specifically, but it can be applied to multiple things. Right, so let's say I wanted to take this second H1 here, and I wanted to give it a class of maybe new topic in CSS. Just like the symbol for an ID is the hashtag, the symbol for a class is a period. So I put period, and then the name of the class there, which is new topic, and then the curly braces to define my declaration block. And any rule that would apply to anything with new topic would apply to that rule. Now, what if I applied some rules to H1? Right, because all of these are still H1s. So what would happen here? And that's actually where the cascade comes in. Because now we have all of these meeting multiple, or some of these meeting multiple qualifications. Right? They're all H1s, so if I applied some rules to H1s, and then some rules to hashtag main topic 2, and some rules to dot new topic, then we'd have overlapping rules here applying to different elements. And so that's where the idea of the cascade comes in. And so any rules that are in conflict are overridden by the rules that come later in the sheet. That's why when you saw me in my demo there, I went back up higher in my style sheet to add my H1 rule, right? Because typically my more specific rules, I want to take precedence. Now, in some of our more advanced classes, we talk about other specificity rules where different things take precedence. For the time being, we're kind of just allowing cascade to take precedence. If you want to make sure something takes precedence, you just put it later in the sheet. It'll 9 times out of 10 work. Right? There are some different rules and different things that kind of take over, but for where we're at, just getting started, right, this is good enough. Because basically the way that you can think of it is that it is applying the rules as it reads the file. Right? So it's applying the rules as it goes through them. So it's going to go through, it's going to say, okay, H1, I'm going to apply all these rules to all the H1s. Okay, now this ID, I'm going to apply all the rules. Well, it had this rule set. Well, now it's going to have this rule set because it meets this new rule. right? So things that come later get overridden. Right, and there are some other things that you can set up, but we'll save that for the future. Remember that we are using linked CSS in our replets. So if you, for whatever reason, deleted the line that looks like the line showed here on the slide, you need to figure out how to add that back in. There was no reason for you to remove that line, so I'm not entirely sure why anyone would have. But if for whatever reason you did, in the head of your document, between the opening head tag and the closing head tag, you should have a line in your document that looks something like this. We can see it in my document here. Right there it is. It's in there by default. If you don't touch anything, right, it's just there. That's what tells the browser that this style.css file is linked to this index.html file, that these two files are together. So it can actually read the code that you put in this file from this file if you have that line there. Otherwise, it won't be able to read that. Same with this JavaScript file, right? We'll need that for later. That's what tells us that this script.js file is linked to this index.html file. So with our time remaining, let's talk about the box model. Just what is the box model? We've already seen a little bit of the box model there. That all of our HTML elements, they can be considered as boxes. So in CSS, the term box model is used when we're talking about design and layout. And when we're laying out a document, the browser's rendering engine represents each element as a rectangular box. We've seen that. By default, for most text-based elements, they are represented as block elements. They are represented as block elements. Which gives us that invisible box that we saw when we were demonstrating there just a couple moments ago. Where it is the full width of the page. And it contains the height of whatever content is in the element. And there is an exception, which is basically inline elements, which are things like our multimedia, pictures, video, audio, things of that nature. We'll talk about how we fix that in just a moment. So there are four basic parts of our box model: the content, the padding, the border, and the margin. And these are the parts from the inside out: the content, the padding, the border, and the margin. And, one way that we can kind of visualize the box model is like this, right? We have the content on the inside here. That's the text. That's the heading. That's, whatever that, you're reading or you're seeing, right? The padding is the space from the edge of the box, between the edge of the box and what's inside of the box. The Border is the edge of the box, basically. And then the margin is the space around the box. It's the space that separates one box from the next box. I like to explain it a little bit differently. I like to explain it in terms of our house again. So let's think about our house. Our house here's our house. Our house is our content. Our house is our content. That's the text. Right? That's whatever is useful that we're using. Right? That's the important stuff. That's where all of the stuff that we need is, right? It's the picture, it's the text, it's the video, it's whatever. Right? Our house is the content. Typically around a house, you'll find a yard. You'll find some space where there's not anything really at. It belongs to the homeowner. Right? It belongs to the homeowner, so it's this same sort of general area that the house is in. But there's not really a whole lot on it. Like it's not really, like it's kind of just some empty space where maybe some stuff can happen, right? That's our padding. So it's just kind of some empty space around our content that still belongs to that content box. Right? It still belongs to the content. It's still inside of that main box. Now, on the edge of that yard, typically, you might find some sort of fence. That clearly defines the edge of that property line. Well, that's your border. And then, sometimes, out beside a house, you might have like some sort of protected lands that might have like some national forests or, maybe some property that just kind of belongs to the government. Some kind of no man's land that really, it's kind of public property. Like you can go out and you can kind of stand on it and you can kind of walk around on it if you want to, but it doesn't really belong to you. Yeah, this is the margin. It's not really your property anymore. Doesn't belong to you anymore. It's kind of a no man's land. Maybe you got a neighbor, way off over here somewhere. So that's kind of separating you from the neighbor. That margin giving you, giving your property some buffer zone to your neighbor's property. That sort of thing, right? So that's kind of like how I like to explain this box model, this visualization of the box model in that sort of way, right? Like it kind of gives us a different idea of how all that works. Right, so when we're talking about content, we're basically talking about width and height. These are our two rules that we can set for content. So if we look at our site here, and we look at our boxes, we can look at our invisible boxes. Let's pull them up here. We see that our width is full width, and our height is just text height, whatever height the content is. So if I go into my CSS and I go into H1 here, that's going to apply it to all three heading level ones that I have so far because of our cascading rules. I can put something like width 500 pixels, height 350 pixels. Right, so now I have a specifically defined width and a specifically defined height. So let's see how that changes our box. And automatically you can see how it changes our box, right? Like you can see a lot more space has been put in there. And if we hover over our elements here, we can see that invisible box that once spanned the entire page. Well, it's now a whole lot smaller. Right, it's only 500 pixels wide by 350 pixels tall. And so I can take and I can adjust that, and I can make it basically be as tall as I want it to. 350 pixels tall might be a little too tall. So I might want to adjust that a little bit, right? Make it a little shorter. If I go to main topic 2 here, though, that's going to focus that second ID for me there, though. So I might want that to be a little bit wider. I might want that to be maybe 750 pixels wide. So I'll add the same rule here, width 750 pixels wide. I can make it, I can make my height different as well. I can make it height 250 pixels, right? However we want to kind of do that there. When we run that, refresh that, we can see now this one, the one that we applied that ID to, has a bigger box around it. Right? If we kind of go back and forth between that one and the one below it, we can see the one below it has a smaller imaginary box than the one above it. And then new topic here, we can do, the same thing, right? We can even take it and make it smaller than the width of what's inside of it, right? So if I wanted to make the width of this one smaller, I can do something really small like width 150. And we can see what happens there, right? Since it's smaller than the text that's inside of it, the width is, it word wraps and it wraps around. Now there is one element or one type of element that is not by default 100% wide, that does not have a content box that's 100% wide, and that is an inline element. And there are multiple types of inline elements, images, videos, so on and so forth. Right, so if I add an image here, and I'm going to add one from Pixum here, which allows me to get just a random photo of a specific size. Is Pixum working? Yeah, there it is. So if we look at our image here and we look at our inspect element tool, and we look at our image, we can see, well, we haven't applied any CSS rules to this image, but when we hover over it, it's just as wide as the content of the image, right? It's not full width. And that's because by default, this is an image element is an inline element. So what we want to do is we want to make it, if we want to work with our box model properties with this element, we need to make it a block level element. So we need to take our IMG and tell it to display as block. And now that we've done that, we can come in here and we can check it. And now we can see that box extends the full width of the page there, right? Whereas it was just the size of the image itself. So that will allow us to do things like the margin centering trick. To this image element. Speaking of, since we're running short on time, let's talk about the margin centering trick. Right? Let's talk about shorthand for padding. Padding and margin. And we'll let everything else be covered by the module content and your reading for the module. Just since we're about to run up against our hour here, just so we don't go, too far over our hour. But padding is basically our space inside of our element block, and margin is our space around the outside of our element block. And there's a shorthand for how we can write it. And so by default, we can write padding like this. With 4 values. Margin we can do the same way with 4 values. 1 value, 2 values, 3 values, 4 values. And you might be wondering, well, what side does each of these values correspond to? And if we were, in a seated class together or something like that, I would ask you to take a guess and tell you that there is a hint. Right, because I have the clock face on the screen for a reason. Right, they're clockwise. So this is padding top, padding left, or actually padding right, padding bottom, and padding left. Another way to remember it is that it spells trouble. TRBL. Trouble. So you could say, well, it's clockwise, or that it spells trouble. So the top value is spacing on the top, inside top of the element. The second value would be spacing on the inside right of the element. The third value would be spacing on the inside bottom of the element. Fourth value would be inside spacing on the left-hand side of the element. And for margin, it would be basically the same thing, except for instead of inside, you would say outside. So if I were doing the same thing for margin, it would be outside top of the element, outside right of the element, outside bottom of the element, outside left of the element. But I can take and I can simplify this even further. Right, so I can look at something like this. And so in this case, when I have 2 values, that's basically taking my shorthand and pressing it even further. And so in this case, I'm taking congruous sides. Right, so in this case, that is top and bottom, left and right. So the first value gives me my padding value for both the top and bottom. So I'm counting it twice if I'm doing the math right, because it represents both of those. and then the left and the right. And so for our centering trick, which is something that I really like, which is, it's how we center, if you hear the old question, how do you center a div? It's the same way, right? Well, this is one way that we do it, right, is using this margin centering trick, is to use auto margin on the left and right. So for example, now that I have my image here displayed as block, this could also be video, this could be whatever else. I could add margin. If I want a top and bottom margin, I could have a little bit of top and bottom margin here, let's say 12 pixels. Doesn't really matter. Right, the top and bottom value is aside the point. What really matters is that my left and right value is automatic. So I'm going to set it to auto. So that's going to take it as far in from the left as it can, and it's going to take it as far in from the right as it can. So when something goes as far in from the left as it can and as far in from the right as it can, the only place for it to meet is in the middle, which allows it to center up. Right, and we can do this on any element. I could do this on, just one of these headings as well, right? Margin. First number, remember, is irrelevant. It could be 0 as well. Margin 0 auto. And it's just going to center that element right up. Now notice it did not center the text. Right? It's not centering the text. It's centering the element. Right? If I hover over the element, that element is centered. When it comes to centering the text, that is a conversation for next week. We'll talk about how we do that next week. So in your module, you'll want to spend some time in your module looking at positioning. That's the other big thing from this module. You'll also want to spend some time looking at, the parts of the box model we didn't really have time to cover in depth in our hour today, which would be padding and border. We do, I do talk about those in the module, so not a huge deal. Right? Remember, I don't try to go into much more than an hour on these, because I think an hour is long enough as it is. I think your attention span, I'm lucky to have your attention span for an hour, so if I get it for more than an hour, I'm super lucky. So that's where we will stop for today. We'll turn the music back on, hang out in the chat for just a couple minutes, just in case anybody who is watching with me live has any questions. If you are watching the recording and you have questions, please send me an email or a Teams message and let me know. But that's all for this week. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.